Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Program's broadcast. I'm Dr. Brad Reedy. Today is Tuesday, May 24th, 2022. The title for tonight's broadcast is Let's Talk About Sex. I was actually having a discussion with my clinical director today, Travis Slagle, and we were discussing the challenge in this particular topic because these are the kind of topics that you'd want to have a dialogue with. You'd want to have a question and answer with. That's why Malia has posted at the outset. If you have any questions, the live audience has any questions, please submit them at any time, and Malia will pass them on to me in order anonymously in the queue. The challenging thing about talking about this is you're talking to people who have a wide variety of values around sex. So I'm just going to do my best to present the science and the principles that I know from psychology as it applies to sex, instead of trying to guess where everybody's particular value set lies. I thought this was fascinating. This came up on my social media feed only about 2 hours before the broadcast this evening from my favorite social media account to go to for quotes. Sophia Cycles, at Sophia Cycles. I just love this account. I love what she's curated here. She writes in today's quote, or she quoting today's quote. She says, "Today, Eros is often mistaken for or reduced to the sexual." I'll start over again. Today, Eros is often mistaken or reduced to the sexual. Many Jungian scholars understand that Eros to be the desire for connection. Eros represents creative energy, which combines the spiritual, emotional, and physical aspects of sexual energy. What I find interesting about this quote as the outset is it reminds me of a story that happened to me when I was in graduate school getting my PhD. I took a dream interpretation class. It was just a small class with about 5 peers, myself, and a graduate student for a professor. And as we were going through this, one of the ideas the professor had was that we would talk about our dreams in class and then we would interpret them, which in retrospect was a horrific idea. So at any rate, the first person went and in his dream he talked about a sexual encounter. It might have even been with somebody in our cohort, in our class, but nonetheless he was talking about sex. And so there was just this real tension in the air in this first dream interpretation class. And the professor said, it's important to remember that in our dreams, sex doesn't represent sex. It often is symbolic for something else. And I remember thinking about that being true, and I paused and I realized and said out loud to the professor, I don't think sex is about sex when we're alive. I think sex is about so many things. And that's one of the reasons why it's such a taboo and so difficult to talk about, because of the complexities of it and our reactions to it culturally in our society. In fact, one of the points that I've talked about over the years, I've even heard the idea that sexual assault or rape is not about sex. And in one way of talking, that's true. It's not about sex in the way that we think about consensual two partners having sex, but it's about sex in the sense that it's the absence of good sex. It is the power or control and the objectification of another person. It's turning somebody else into an object. And that's on one end of the continuum of sex, of really bad sex, or even a crime, right? An assault on a human being is the most severe end of that power differential in sex. But that healthy sex is the surrender of two souls, the surrender of two people coming together and sharing their vulnerability, their trust with each other, their figurative and literal naked selves with each other. As I talk about sex this evening, one of the things that's important, I think, is that we just talk about it. I don't think I felt this kind of inadequacy coming into a webinar or broadcast, a podcast, as I have this evening. In fact, I had to get a pep talk by Malia earlier today, the one who does my moderating, asking her about what kind of questions, what people are looking for, because I didn't know where to start. I didn't even know where to start with it. But then I realized as I went on and created the slides that would become my outline and my template for what I have to say this evening, that one of the things I went back to over and over again was that we have to push ourselves out of our comfort zone in order to have a healthy pro-sexual environment in our house. We have to be willing to confront the taboos and the messages from previous generations that they've laid upon us. And by the way, when I say prosexual, I'm not talking about any specific, um, excuse me, any specific idea about premarital sex or the frequency of sex. I'm talking about that we have a positive outlook about sex and about our bodies and about intimacy in a sexual manner. So, with that long preamble, let's get into some of the topics. Sometimes sexual acting out behaviors, risky sex, um, can be a sign, like any other mental health issue, of a symptom of something that is um, unmet or unhealed in us. One of the things I talk about when I talk to couples that are dealing with infidelity, for example, is I say the most common response on the violator of the infidelity is the response of shame and guilt, and this intense promise that seeks to reassure the hurt party that they regret it and that it'll never happen again. And while that kind of energy might seem well founded and a natural reaction to an infidelity and the discovery and the discussion around it, what I have learned is that you have to address the issue beneath the sex. It's not just about white knuckling it and promising not to deal with it, but you have to, like any other symptom that we see in life, you have to go beneath the behavior. You have to be able to look and understand the symbolism and what it means. And healing that work, that deeper work is, I think, the best way to ensure trust in a relationship and the best way to utilize that guilt and that shame that wells up inside of us when we violate or hurt somebody that we care about. So when we talk about acting out sex, whatever that means to you, cheating on a partner, for example, like I said, dangerous sex, we're talking about a symptom, just like we would be talking about substance use, gambling, lying, right? Violence or aggression. The sex becomes an attempt to solve a problem that otherwise is going unaddressed. And that's really important, especially because, like many other symptoms, we have such a visceral, strong reaction to the topic of sex with our children, partners, with people that we interact with, that very reaction will create in the person who's struggling, who the offender, if you will, the one who's demonstrating sex as a symptom, some kind of sexual behavior as a symptom. It immediately communicates to them that they're not safe, that they have to take care of the one who's being triggered by it. So the more we talk about it, even during this broadcast tonight, even if this is a discussion you can have with your co-parent or your partner, the better. The question becomes, what is it communicating? One of the things that I talk about with somebody who's participated in sexual acting out behaviors is I ask them, if this behavior, if we could reframe this behavior as a solution, then we would ask you or the person involved, we would ask you, what is it trying to solve? What's it communicating to us? Just like I talk about when I talk about any other kind of behavior modification, that it's important and wise to first consider what the behavior is telling us before we go about trying to change it. Across the board, even with children in our wilderness therapy program, the most common first instinct to a violation of rules, norms, commitments, agreements, trust, the most common response, initial response, is, I'm sorry, I'll get better. I'll do it better. And I often say to clients, let's slow down that repair. Let's slow it down and take enough time to see what's really going on for you. You're not in trouble per se, not in the clinical sense. Since clinical work isn't about being in trouble and right or wrong or cracking somebody over the nose with a newspaper when they make a mistake. It's about using that information to learn what's going on for you. Something is communicating, and it becomes our job as therapists. And if we are to participate in this kind of a discussion with our children or with our partners, it's our job to develop better hearing and ears to hear it. Like I said, talking about sex, even tonight, is an important step in the right direction. One of the things that I hear a lot from parents is I hear about their shame around the issue of sex projected onto the child. That is, they imagine how they would feel if their sexual behavior was exposed or talked about by others, and they project onto the child what they think is an obvious reaction to that kind of exposure, shame. And the fact of the matter is this: the child may feel some shame about it. That's a fact. But it's important that we do our own work around sexuality, our sexuality, to be able to see what's there for us, so we can differentiate between our shame and other people's shame, our children's shame. Where do your values come in? I had somebody just ask me this today about another subject, only tangentially related to what we're talking about today. And one of the things I said is that there's one truth that I know about these kinds of values is that there's no right answer. You get to choose. You get to choose what feels right to you, and the values that you want to live by, and the values you want to try to teach your children. The warning is that when we have ideas or boundaries around limitations to sex, like premarital sex, for example, or that if we have the idea that casual sex for fun, if practiced safely, is outside of our value system, if that's our situation, it's important that we talk about it in as much detail and with its deserved complexity, so as not to throw the proverbial baby out with the bathwater. That is, a lot of children, because the way that sex is talked about in childhood, when they get married, they are wholly unprepared to think about sex any different. They have been so conditioned and so taught to think about sex as wrong. Not sex before marriage is wrong, but to think they can't make that distinction. So your values come in, but again, this is a complex issue. And brief, what I've heard psychologists refer to as drive-by conversations don't do it the justice that it needs. It can relate to body image, and again, it can relate to somebody's participation. I cannot tell you the numbers of people who tell me that they understand that their parents were trying to teach them a value system where sex outside of marriage or a committed relationship was unacceptable, but that message bled over onto sex is itself in some way dirty, in some way bad. One of the things that I've learned to celebrate so much is the lens of psychology and therapy in its kind of neutral position around right and wrong. We look at things not as right and wrong, but we look at things as healthy or unhealthy, right? Or as we look at things as um, something might be broken or unhealed or wounded or healed or repaired. The language is less moral, and so it has less of a weight on children. So we can talk about. I talk about drugs this way with my 14-year-old. I say, look, if you want to experiment with drugs when you get older, that's fine. But I'm going to fight the battle now, because what my science tells me is that introducing substances to people in their teens predisposes them to addiction. So it's not that I have a moral position about drug usage. I really don't. In fact, I often say if using cocaine would improve people's life, I would teach people how to do it. But it's just a very pragmatic discussion. So watch how that language and what you're trying to teach can bleed over. Can you talk about sex, orgasms, penises, um, the vulva? Can you talk about those things with your children at the same time? I remember my wife said to me some years ago, it was really a shock to me, actually. Um, some years ago, my children were, it actually wasn't that long ago. It was like 2 years ago, 3 years ago, maybe. My now 20-year-old and now 14-year-old were talking about their menstrual cycles or periods or something like that. And I acted like it was uncomfortable for me. And my wife pulled me aside and said, "You're kind of being the sitcom dad, and you're communicating to your children that their menstrual cycle and their bodies, what is natural, is somehow uncomfortable and therefore somehow shameful." And she was absolutely right. My wife was absolutely right. I was playing that role. Since that day, there actually have been discussions where I have felt some discomfort because I'm not accustomed to it, but where I've forced myself because of my belief in the health of talking with my children, my wife, my family about sexual functioning, about sexual activities, about the act of sex and the spiritual nature of it. So creating a positive sex home environment. If the only thing you talk about is what not to do and the rules of it, it's like a slice of the sexual pie. But like I said, if you can talk about orgasms, masturbation, you can talk about uh, you can talk about the reproductive act using the proper appropriate terms. Then your children know that it's safe. We communicate so much to them through our unconscious. One of the things that I'm thinking about when teaching therapists these days, and I'll apply it to this, is that the reason that skills aren't quite enough, that tools aren't quite enough, is because if we simply or merely practice saying things a different way, but we haven't done the work to resolve our unconscious dilemmas, our unconscious speaks to their unconscious. So if we're not comfortable with it, this again is another thing we can talk to a therapist about, that we can talk to somebody that we trust about this topic and talk about where our hangups are. Like a lot of symptoms that our children display, one of the things that they gravitate toward is the thing that upsets parents the most. I have been absolutely amazed in my lifetime, uh, absolutely amazed how every generation has been capable of creating a new kind of popular music from the Beatles and the Rolling Stones to Led Zeppelin to rap music. I am just absolutely amazed that each generation has found a way to make new music that offends the older generation. And I've made it one of my causes to try, instead of judging. I remember, in fact, years ago, finally thinking, what, I'm not going to talk about rap music the way that I've been taught to talk about rap music, to think about it in only a negative light. And I'm going to ask that my group members in my wilderness group to give me their favorite rap album. I'm going to listen to it, and I'm going to try to hear what attracts them to it. And like I said, part of what attracts them to it, is because it upsets the parents. So one thing to always consider when our children are acting out in certain ways is the function of the symptom. It is part of the function of the symptom to get parents riled up. One of the ways to make something not as provocative is to normalize it. But we're terrified of normalizing behavior because we have been taught to normalize it. We've been taught that the only way to manage behavior is through shame, fear, and guilt. And we are terrified that if we take away shame, fear, and guilt from any discussion about anything, then people will just go absolutely crazy. And by the way, sometimes there is an interim or a middle part of the process where it does look like that, where it gets very messy. But again, talking about sex as much as possible. If the only thing we talk about is what not to do, we are absolutely probably dealing with our own hangups and communicating to our children unconsciously, which they're reading unconsciously, that sex is in some ways a bad thing, even when it's done within the constraints of what we believe to be acceptable. I love the pragmatic and scientific lens. Um, I've just found it. I've had a lot of people come to me from many religions, many conservative lifestyles, and try to get me to kind of instill that ideology into their child. And what I've learned and asked for parents is, look, there's another way to talk about drugs or sex or oppositionality without talking about it in that moral way, without talking about it with the layering of shame and guilt that comes along with moralizing with children. We can just talk about it pragmatically. And that's why I'm such a fan when a child asks in treatment, what's in it for me? I feel like we have a good starting point because I do have some ideas about what's in it for you. you have to kind of be a student and like I said, push yourself and ask questions. Esther Perel is a great source nowadays. If anybody else has any others that they want to share, there are great. My wife and I have watched the Goop series on, believe it's on Netflix, run by Gwyneth Paltrow, where she talks about orgasms in different ways, different sexual responses. Some people respond to energy, some to touch, some to visual, some to erotic storytelling, and being able to talk about that. Having my children walk through the room when there are on the Goop documentary that we're watching, pictures of various vulvas. I just learned in the last few years, this is my own vulnerability. I did not know that the external genitalia that we see and that I've been calling a vagina my entire life is really the vulva. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, Google it after we're done. That's an example of something I've learned in my 50s. I mean, that's amazing. I did not know the proper term for what I was calling the vagina for 50 years of my life. I also didn't know that the clitoris what was such a large organ. I thought it was this little for the first part of my life, I didn't know what it was. Didn't even know it existed. For the second part of my life, I thought it was this little tiny thing. And now that my wife has introduced me to this sex positive education, I realize that it starts there right above the vulva and goes down and inside of the vagina. So let people help you. You have to be a student. I'm even experiencing some anxiety talking about this tonight, not because I think it's wrong, but because I'm afraid of the cultural conditioning that I've been taught, that I've been exposed to, that says for a therapist to talk about this with a wide audience like this, that something might be inappropriate about it. So I'll just own that myself. And in the end, trying to talk about it, I was talking to the therapists at Evoke about this just today. It's really important that we talk about we were able to model to our clients and in this case to maybe your children a kind of a not knowing, a humility, a fallibility. That's what we want them to be able to demonstrate and operate within is not knowing, accountability, being able to own up to mistakes or what they don't know, being teachable. But we have to be teachable. We have to that's the best way to encourage teachability is to model it. When you can show up not knowing and you can show up as uncomfortable as this may or may not be to you with your child having these kinds of discussions, you're showing them how to do it. Some important things to talk about: consent for all genders, for young boys, for young women, for transgender, non-binary. It's consent is something that we talk about. I think the nugget for this evening, at least the nugget that as I was going through thinking about what I would talk to you guys about this evening, the nugget this evening is that the discussion of consent, this is also something that my wife and children have taught me, is communicated by the boundaries that we allow our children to keep. One of the things I've learned as a father and a stronger person than my children, for example, is that I don't, even when they're younger, I don't tickle them when they ask me to stop. I don't touch them when they ask me not to. I have seen parents in sessions when children have asked them for space, just physical space. I have seen parents violate that, believing that they know what the child needed better than the child know, reach over and touch them on the shoulder or on the knee. And while you might think that that's just your idea about showing affection, the way that we teach consent is by the way we respond to our children's appropriate boundaries. Another thing that I've had to learn as a father, again, I wish I had learned these things a lot earlier, is that teasing my children, joking with my children, what I would say playfully making fun of them, just fun banter with children. That it's important that I respect their boundary when they say stop, that they be allowed to, when children are younger, we give them timeout sometimes. And when children become teenagers, they take a timeout. So how we respect our children's boundaries will teach them as much about consent as any discussion about consent. And of course, we teach our young boys and our men who are most likely to be guilty of sexual assault. We teach them about consent. We teach all genders of children that you're allowed to say no at any given point in a sexual interaction with somebody, in a sexual relationship. That young girls aren't responsible for what boys think and their feeling of arousal. That boys are responsible for. These are fundamental principles that really, again, have their connection to things that are non-sexual. But remember, like from the beginning, sex isn't about sex. Sex is about relationship, vulnerability, shame, intimacy, fear, joy, right? Trust. It's about a lot of things. We talk about one of the consequences that I've tried to, I don't even like the word consequence. One of the outcomes for my children, for example, if I find out that my children are looking at porn, is that we're going to talk about sex in adult ways, that we're going to have conversations about it. And I'm not going to push past uncomfortable boundaries. I'm going to give you the dignity, but I'm going to say some things about it in our house. I'm going to have this. It's not something that I'm going to force on you, but it's something that I'm going to invite into a discussion. It's going to be something that, for me at least, is not my shame is not getting in the way of talking about it. This double standard, when a female has many sexual partners, they tend to be referred to in derogatory ways. Terms like being called a slut in high school, whereas men who have the same amount of partners, even more, we tend to in our culture to look up to them, to think of them as to think of it as their sexual prowess. So the double standard around sex is pretty profound. Again, another area which I would love to deny that I would love to say I've never had those thoughts about it, but I have. And like so much in this work, I've said this recently with regard to other topics. Mm, and this is a huge nugget above and beyond what we're talking about today with sex. Um, the fact of the matter is that everybody, everybody within the sound of my voice has biases and limitations and dents and bruises. And mental health is not about getting rid of all of those. Mental health is about knowing our wounds and our dents and our bruises and our issues, our dilemmas, our complexes, and finding some way to make peace with our, what I would just say is our human self. And in so doing, that's where the healing begins and starts to occur. So when you're talking about sex, when you're talking about um, biases, when you're talking about your shame, your fears, your discomfort, I'm not saying get comfortable tomorrow. I'm saying talk about the discomfort. Talk about the ignorance that you feel. Talk about the body image and the sexual image and ideas that you have. Talk about it with somebody. Like I said, there's so much. I remember I had a father kind of bridging this gap between boundaries in general and sex. I had a father saying to me when his young adult daughter was leaving our program, he was saying, I don't want her to go back with her old boyfriend. He was such a bad influence, such a negative person in her life. And there's a way that I could manipulate and control her. He was trying to brainstorm with me actually to not be with this young man, this boy again. What can I do? And I said, it doesn't work that way. You can't really, with your young adult daughter, you can't really control her and at the same time empower her to stand up to another man. See, it doesn't work that way. We can't use our emotions to try to control our children and then tell them what other people think about them doesn't matter. That's nonsense. You can't apply one rule to one situation, and that's not the way that the human brain works. The human brain doesn't distinguish on a very core level between mom and dad making me responsible for their feelings and then going out in the world and becoming a people pleaser for that exact same reason that I'm applying to everybody else. How we think about and create boundaries will have more to do with our children's idea around consent and their own sexual empowerment and freedom and positive nature about themselves than anything else. How we talk and how we feel about it will leak onto them, right? It will impact them. It's the air they breathe and the water that they are swimming in, the soup, as I like to say, that they're cooked in. So just like almost every topic, the invitation is do your work, sort it out, talk to your therapist about sex, talk about your sexual experience, talk about orgasms, talk about intimacy with your partner, talk about masturbation, talk about things that make you uncomfortable because these are the kinds of topics that that children are paying attention to when we don't talk about them, when we can't say them. Of all the things that I wish I could go back and simply fix in my own parenting, I know that's a almost a useless exercise. It would be to go back and not be the sitcom dad because I was just doing it. I thought it was funny and charming. Like I said, until my wife told me that it was having consequences, pointed out that it was having consequences. Um, this topic about having privacy, you know, our children, this is a difficult topic, this part, because our children deserve dignity, right? They deserve to have boundaries. They deserve to have privacy when it comes to their own bodies and their own sexuality. And at the same time, part of our responsibility, part of our charge is to create situations in a home environment where our children feel safe with us and practicing safe sexual behavior with others. Sending nudes on Snapchat or texting, sexting, contacting people on the internet, those types of things. Having unprotected sex, not being on birth control and taking the risk of getting pregnancy. The list goes on. So again, I don't consider myself the sexual expert per se at all, but what I know is having discussions. I have failed at some of these discussions, even within the last 2 or 3 months. I have failed at these discussions. I have fumbled and stumbled and made mistakes and when and how I approached it. And like all fumbles, it gives me an opportunity to go back to my children and say, I'm sorry. And when I've fumbled and I've been able to go back and say, I'm sorry, it's as good and maybe even better than if I'd gotten it right in the first place. Because one of the things in our family is that dad always gets it right. Dad always knows best. And sometimes I like to cling on to that myself. So making mistakes, fumbling through it is better than not talking about it, better than avoiding it. So we have to find a balance, and you have to find that balance between respecting their privacy and at the same time providing them with guidance to protect them. How we talk about, how we think about our children, and there's some difficulty thinking about our children as sexual beings. Something I've been learning over the past handful of years that my I have 4 children from 14 to 29, and they are sexual creatures. Their sexuality is a part of their life. And so just realizing that, being able to be comfortable with it in my own head has been one of the challenges. But how we receive, how we feel them will make all the difference in their world. I once had a colleague when I was in graduate school, a professor asked, would you rather walk in on your child finding out that they are smoking marijuana or masturbating? And one of my colleagues said, I definitely would rather find out that they're smoking weed than masturbating. And it gives you a glimpse into a cultural idea, and in her case, a religious idea that definitely could send a message to the child that something about sex and masturbation in their own bodies is bad and ugly and wrong and unacceptable. Very, very dangerous, of course. Sex is about connection. This is kind of a summary of what sex is about. Because as we've talked about, sex isn't about sex. It's about connection. Like I talked about, rape is about sex. It's just about the worst kind of sex. It's about sexual abuse and power and control and objectification. It's about power versus intimacy. To the extent that there's a power differential in a relationship, intimacy is threatened. And sex is the perfect manifestation of that intimate balance, right? Especially for the female sexual system. The female system has to be relaxed. For females, it's about trust, it's about receiving, about acceptance, about surrendering. Men, on the other hand, the biggest barrier for them is about performance, right? About being good enough, adequate enough. And so each come with their various baggage that comes from their cultural conditioning and the ability to which they can surrender, let down their walls, trust and share and take a risk. It's to the extent that sex becomes an amazing and wonderful and beautiful thing. Power and intimacy, it's about trust. It's about knowing yourself, a lot about knowing yourself. Again, when we think of sex as a symbol, as a metaphor for our lives, it's like everything else we talk about on these podcasts. It's a lot about knowing yourself, or the shame that we feel, the exiled parts of ourselves that we have created because we were taught that parts of ourselves. I hear constantly. I hear more about men than I do about women. Where, well, that's not true. It's just different, I suppose. But I hear constantly about how folks are shamed for their sexual fantasies, their sexual urges. It's like being shamed for being hungry. I have had some really good success with not shaming people that are involved in compulsive sexual activities, compulsive masturbation, serial infidelities. I've had so much more success about de-shaming and understanding and validating. I had one client many years ago who shared with me that they were afraid after an infidelity because that they had confessed to without getting caught, that they had this trigger in their head. By the way, this I just thought about four stories where this has happened, and in each case, the trigger that comes up in their head when they start to think about sex with somebody who's not their intimate partner, they want to shove that down. They feel terrified of it. It could lead to, if entertained, they believe it could lead to the behavior that caused they and their partner so much shame. But what I've told those folks is I've said, let's just pause for a moment. Let's take the taboo out of it. The fantasy that you were having, what was it about? A common example was it was about being wanted and about being desired. It was about not having to work to be accepted. And then I've taken that information. I said, I think that's something those are things you can talk to your partner about. I can help if you want. But if you can talk to your partner about how you might be feeling unwanted as you are, unattractive as you are, why you find it so difficult at times to communicate because of the shame and the baggage that both of you have. Those are discussions we can have. We can sort out, right? Like Fred Rogers said, if it's mentionable, it's manageable. We can talk about those things and manage them and go through them. It'll be difficult and triggering for both of you, but we can do that. But if you just take that sexual image out of your head and push it away, because it's a bad thing, we won't get to what your psyche is trying to teach you about, trying to ask you about, trying to tell you about. I really like the idea of taking responsibility for your sexual life. One of the things that I've learned as I've grown up to be in a mature sexual relationship with my wife is to talk about our own sexual wants and desires and likes and dislikes, and to be assertive and courageous about the vulnerability of sharing that with each other, asking for what we need, recognizing that there are different drives in different partners, that one might have a drive to want to have sex 3 or 4 times a week, and one might be fine with it once or a week or once every couple of weeks. And how do we talk about that? Again, it's like every other thing in our life. And again, I think the big light bulb for me tonight is that how we talk about boundaries in general in the family will go a long way toward talking about consent and empowering our children to own their own consent, and encouraging our children to respect other people's consent or not, or lack of consent. Our self-image is wrapped up in our sexuality so much, both, all genders, right? How we look, the size of our penis, the size of our breasts, how skinny we are, all of those things are a part of it. Everybody's dealing with something in those areas. Most people, I shouldn't say everybody, but most people have some issues, hangups around that. Talking about that, there's just so much liberty, and there's so much freedom in naming. I remember I don't remember the topic, but I was saying something to a student many years ago in the wilderness. I think I was talking with him about one assignment I came up with for him was, can you identify all the ways that people can manipulate you, peers and your parents? And I remember he said, I, I might be able to do that assignment, but I don't want to share it with anybody, especially my parents. And I asked him why not, and he said, well, because if I do, I feel like it'll give them license, or at least the idea about what will work. And I explained to him, just like everything I'm talking about tonight, I said, talking about it doesn't give it more power. It's already there. What's there is there. Talking about it takes away its power. Talking about my own body image, talking about my own self medicating, the list goes on, gives me, it doesn't give those things more power in my life. I mean, I think that that's part of the energy behind denial and repression, right? If we don't talk about it, if we don't address it, if I can just not act out again and just do it better going forward, it'll all be okay. We'll smooth it over. One of the things that the 12-step groups teach us about the catharsis of sharing is that we talk about our self-medicating behavior, and it reduces its power over us, not the opposite. Again, self-image is wrapped up in all of this, and safety and consent is ubiquitous. It is in a lot of what we do with our children. One of the biggest lessons I learned when my oldest was a middle teenager, something my therapist said to me. She said simply, when I was asking about challenging my son on something he was or wasn't doing, and she said, children need their dignity. And that statement, that session changed me. It made me less intrusive. It made me less likely to steamroll or try to shred through other people's boundaries, but to be gentle and hold them and understand that they're serving some purpose. The take homes for today are just talk about it. Talk about it with your equals, your partners, your therapist. I don't have all the answers. I don't know how to do it perfectly. Like I said, I've made mistakes. I've learned things that I didn't know my entire life, even recently, and that's just part of the deal. Healthy boundaries, like everything else, are the key to sexual boundaries, to our own bodies. I've told the story before about driving on a frozen lake as an analogy for dealing with other people's resistance. If you can imagine driving a car on a solid frozen lake, You know intuitively that if you press too much gas, you lose traction. If you press on the brake too hard, you lose traction. If you turn too sharply to the left or to the right, you lose traction. So when I talk about driving on a frozen lake, I'm saying if something starts to go south, be willing to ditch it. Be willing to chalk it up as a failure, to apologize, to take a time out, to get some counsel from somebody else or to process it with somebody else and then come back later. You will fail at this. And if the goal is to get it perfect and to know everything before you talk about it, you'll never talk. And the child will again internalize the lack of discussion around sexuality as something about it must be bad and wrong. Doesn't matter the context of it, even if it's within a marriage. And as always, sorting out our shame instead of projecting it on others. So many times I've asked parents, your child's reputation you seem to be concerned about. Let's ask them how they feel about it. And about half the time we ask the child, they say, doesn't bother me. I don't care what the uncles and aunts think of me being here. Sometimes they do, which again is probably the legacy of intergenerational trauma around a specific topic in mental health. But be willing to drop it. Be willing to drop it and be willing to own it yourself instead of projecting it on them. Understanding that the messages in the home around sexuality will be heard by the child, whether they're spoken consciously or not, overtly or not. So you might as well make some of it overt. Children deserve their dignity. Doesn't mean we can't guide and have boundaries at all. It means we must have boundaries. And we are charged with guiding them. But understanding that when they feel threatened or unsafe, nothing's getting through or nothing will be retained. Do you have a sex positive home? Have you spiritually, conceptually thrown out the baby with the bathwater? Because in your attempt to control your child's sexual behavior, have you inadvertently communicated to them that that part of them, their sexual nature, is somehow innately bad or evil or unacceptable? Talk to peers and adults. Talk to your therapist. Role play with others. Role play with your co-parent. Role play with your therapist. Again, the very idea of role playing, talking about sex with your children, with your partner, or with peers, or with your therapist, will bring up for a lot of us that anxiety because we're not comfortable because we didn't grow up in a sex positive culture. We grew up in a culture where that was dominated by fears and insecurities, unspoken taboos. I don't know how much this helped. I really don't. I don't know how well I did. I usually feel pretty confident. This is one that, like I said, I came into this saying I'm just going to model for everybody. So if I fumbled through it or said some stupid things, let me know. I'll apologize and learn from it. But I hope it's at least hope it ties together some things that often we don't think about. Hope we understand that how we talk about boundaries is how our children will learn about consent, and that it's important that we understand that sex is not about sex. Somebody says, what would you say to setting boundaries around sex for high schoolers? Strong boundaries. As in, if you choose to have sex before you're an adult, my boundary is that you go back to a vote. Well, you're asking me what I think, what I would do. I'm not going to answer that. I want to so badly. I really do. But I think it will miss the point that it's not my choice to make. Because what if I'm wrong? And you take what I do because I'm educated and I can do a good podcast as the truth. It's not. I don't know. You get to decide. Based on the volume of work that I presented in these podcasts, these broadcasts, you get to decide. Somebody says the best way to help a non-binary child figure themselves out, where would you start the discussion? I have a broadcast, and Malia, you can look it up, where I talk about sex and gender, more about the LGBTQ issues. And I was actually going to repeat a lot of that tonight, and I decided not to, so I'll direct you toward that. Um, what I had to do to understand how to welcome and connect to non-binary child and to non-binary clients is I had to, like most things, I had to unlearn what I learned through my culture, through my family about gender and sex. So I would talk to them the same way I talk about a child who's heterosexual. I might be curious or ask questions. I guess I would not put, when what I talk about in the gender, the LGBTQ broadcast that Malia is going to share the link to in a minute. Um, you know, when a child comes out as gay or comes out as non-binary or transgender, and parents say, among other things, they say things like, well, you haven't figured yourself out yet. You're only 14, 15, 16, or whatever the number is. Just imagine saying that if they were heterosexual and cisgender, which means that their gender is consistent with the gender that they were assigned at birth, cisgender. If your child came and said to you, I'm cisgender and heterosexual, would you say to them, well, you don't really know yourself. You're only 14 or 15 or 16. And so you haven't really figured that out yet. And the answer is 99% of the time, the answer is no, you wouldn't say that. So if you would say it to a heterosexual cisgender person, that's a good measure. In general, we welcome it. We celebrate their courage. We encourage them to do what they need to take care of themselves to feel safe. But the actual gender identity, non-binary or transgender, is really, for me, it's as if my child comes to me. I've learned this. It's taken a long time. As if my child comes to me and says, my favorite color just changed from green to blue. It's not relevant in how I think or feel about them. Now, if I have my own grief work to do around giving up the idea of having a son or having a daughter or having grandchildren, whatever the losses might be mine, I process that with my people, not with them. I go to the Pride Center here in Salt Lake City, or I just happen to have a really gifted therapist. I go to my therapist and I talk about that there. Or I've had people reach out to me because I've disclosed that I have a non-binary transgender child. That people have come to me just to talk to another parent, not as a parenting expert, but just to talk to me about it. And I've said to them, it's not. I've not been flawless at it. I stumbled for sure at the coming out. I said some really dumb things that first night. And I've made mistakes since. And it's not, although I can speak to how I aspire to be in relationship to my child, in private conversation with friends who are dealing with it, I've shared that I've struggled and that I'm a work in progress and that I have an ambition to be there for my child in the way that they need. And I have to take care of myself in my spaces. Somebody writes, when do you suggest healing one's own sexuality? How do you imagine that process can happen? Therapy. I said this to somebody today. I've been going to therapy with this particular therapist I have right now for 23 years. And it's individual therapy, the bulk of it. The great majority of it is individual therapy. But I talk about sex. I talk about my relationship with my wife. I talk about my relationship with my children. I talk about my relationship with coworkers, with my family of origin, with my job, with clients. I talk about all of it. So again, sex is something that has come up in our conversations, but it's in the context of being a whole person that I talk about it. So Um, when you're healing yourself in one area, it kind of heals in other areas. And when you're dented in one area, it kind of bleeds over into other areas. When it rains, it pours. People don't usually have pathology in one narrow area in their life. That's a fallacy. You don't just have problem with road rage. That's not your issue. Procrastination is not your issue. Impotence is not your issue, right? Low to no sexual desire or elevated sexual desire is not your issue, right? It's just representative of a part of what you're dealing with as a human. So just go to therapy and work on all of it, and it will come up in the context of dealing with a safe therapist. I had a friend recently tell me that they'd graduated from therapy after a couple of years. The therapist had graduated them, I think was the language that they used. And I wrote a blog about this a few years ago about graduating from therapy. I don't even know what that means. It's like graduating from working out. It's like going to the gym every day for 2 years or 3 years or 5 years or 10 years, and then the lifetime fitness people over there at the 24-hour gym say, "You're done. You don't have to do it anymore." It's not the way that it works. Or you go to the dentist and you have a clean bill of health and you've been flossing perfectly, and they say, "Oh, you're done. You've graduated from dental checkups." Right? We're human. This is a work in progress. All right, I'll go to the upcoming issues and see if there's one more question at the end. Oh, actually, we're out of time. Like I said, I hope this was beneficial. I'll take any feedback that you want to give to me, especially the constructive feedback. The Journey of the Heroic Parent and The Audacity to Be You, my 2 books, are on Amazon and on Audible. So go there if you want more there. We have charitable partners if you want to give back. ChooseMentalHealth.org, Sky'sTheLimitFund.org, or EvokeFamilyFoundation.org are places to go, places that we partner with. If you want a support group, if you're a current or alumni Wilderness family, we have support groups each week. May 26th at 6:30 p.m. is the next one. Once a month, we have an alumni-only meeting for Wilderness, June 28th at 6:30 p.m. And then we have an intensives once a month, June 14th at 6 p.m. is our next offering. Email intensives@evoketherapy.com if you want more information, or go to our website. If you want to do a deep dive in your own work and sexuality is a part of it, Finding You is a great place to do your own work. I can't think of a better use of your time and money than doing an immersive experience like a Finding You workshop or intensive. June 16th through 20th is the next offering. We have a young adult offering, June 10th through 13th, specifically programmed for young adults, June 10th through 13th. And then online, we have an online offering. That's for people where time and money might be a factor. It happens over a weekend, June 24th through 26th, Friday afternoon, Saturday and Sunday. June 24th through 26th is the Finding You online. Intensives@evoketherapy.com for more information. We also have coaches if you want a life coach, parenting coach, relationship coach, attachment-based trained therapists at Evoke offer coaching. Just contact coaching@evoketherapy.com if you want to sign up for a coach. We have pursuits programs. Think of adventure trips worldwide, customized for families or adults anywhere around the globe, 3 to 30 days, customized for each participant. We ask all family members of Evoke participants to attend 6 12-step support groups, any combination of Al-Anon, CODA, Families Anonymous, or adult children. You can also go to refugeerecovery.org or NAMI.org to get free classes or information in your local area, your local chapter. All of these broadcasts are available on your podcast app, your favorite podcast app, or Spotify. Just search Finding You and Evoke Therapy Podcast, or on SoundCloud.com. You can find us there searching the same thing. Also, all of these broadcasts are on our YouTube channel. So if you want to watch and you want to look at the slides, go to our YouTube channel. These are posted the next day. You can find Evoke and myself, Brad Reedy, on Twitter and Instagram using the handles @EvokeTherapy and @Dr. Brad Reedy, respectively. Or you can find Evoke Intensives on Instagram using the handle @EvokeTherapy Intensives. On Facebook, you can find us by searching Evoke Therapy Programs or Evoke Therapy Intensives. And we also have a blog with new content each week curated by the wonderful Malia Boyd, who is also our moderator for this evening. Looks like that's all the questions we have for this evening. Again, hope this is a helpful point of contact. More than anything else, thank you for being willing to do your work for and on behalf of the people that you love and that love you. Thanks for doing your own work. Take care, folks. Talk to you next time. Bye-bye.